This morning, we are interviewing Georgia du Plessis. Georgia du Plessis is the legal officer, or a legal officer for Europe ADF International. And ADF International is not dissimilar to 4SA. It's a faith-based legal advocacy organization working towards defending human dignity and the freedoms of all peoples globally, and obviously specifically in the European context. And as we've been preparing for this discussion, one of the things that we are keenly aware of in Europe, as in here, as in many other parts of the world, is that freedom of religion and belief, particularly freedom of expression, freedom to live out your faith, freedom to speak about your faith, these are also under attack and have certainly been under attack in Europe. And in many ways, as we've noticed, South Africa is a little bit behind Europe. So almost as the way you see Europe is today is where South Africa could find itself tomorrow. So we're very delighted, Georgia, to have you with us this morning. Thank you so much for joining us, and a big welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Daniela, for having me this morning.
Absolute pleasure. We're really looking forward to this interview. We've been looking forward to it for a while.
Yes,
so let's just kick off with a sort of a theme setting question. So are freedom of religion and belief rights and freedom of expression properly protected in the EU? How is that rolled out? We know how it works here with our constitution, section 15 particularly, but in Europe, tell us how the protections can work in your context.
Thank you, Michael. Well, the context in Europe is somewhat more complex than, for example, one national legal system. For example, just if we talk about the South African legal system, there's one constitution applicable, there's a number of laws applicable, and that simplifies. It's still complex, but it simplifies it somewhat. But if we look at Europe, we have the European Union, and then we have the Council of Europe, and these two bodies are already confusing. For example, the European Union, they call a supranational system, and which entails 27 different member states. And so they have to integrate all the laws of these member states. They have to manage the relationships. And then you also have the Council of Europe, which has 46 member states, which they call an international human rights organization. Now, freedom of religion or belief and freedom of expression are very well protected in both these organizations, in the Council of Europe and in the European Union. And in the Council of Europe, you might have heard about the European Convention on Human Rights. And this is the document, the international human rights document in Europe that protects various human rights. And then we have from the European Union side, also applicable to various European member states, we have the EU Fundamental Charter, or the EU Charter on Fundamental Human Rights. And both these documents, the European Convention on Human Rights and the EU Charter on Fundamental Rights, both of them protect freedom of religion or belief and freedom of expression. So the EU Charter, there's one article in this charter that consolidates, that basically says the European Convention is applicable to the European Union, and therefore, as the right to freedom of religion is interpreted in these in the European Convention, and the right to freedom of expression is interpreted in this convention, it finds application to the entire European Union. And these two rights are very well protected in the European Convention, for example, and they look very much like what we find in Articles 18 and 19 and 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or in other words, the United Nations document containing all the civil and political rights. So in short, yes, and in theory, freedom of expression and freedom of religion and belief are very well protected in most of the member states in the European Union, as well as within the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Union Charter on Fundamental Rights. And we can discuss more about what this protection looks like.
Okay, I love how you said in theory. I think that is a very good disclaimer at the bottom. So I've always wondered, I mean, when one looks at freedom of religion and belief, I mean, in the South African Constitution, and you can let us know if this is the same in the EU's Charter and the Council of Europe's EU Convention, we have Article 15 or Section 15, which protects freedom of religion, belief, conscience, opinion, and thought. So even though colloquially we call it freedom of religion and 4SA is known as freedom of religion, South Africa, it's a very fundamental human right that goes to protecting your very thought life, your opinions and your beliefs and your ability to speak about those publicly and live those out publicly. When one looks at freedom of religion and belief and freedom of expression in Europe, what is the history in ambit? Because obviously South Africa is a new democracy. Our final constitution is, you know, from 1996, so it's not even 30 years old yet. Obviously, Europe is has a much longer history, constitutional history than that. Perhaps could you talk to us a bit about the history of those rights and whether or not they've always been protected? Because I'm pretty sure if one were to go back to AD 05, they probably weren't.
Yes, that's a very good question, because it starts, it's historically very complex in Europe, and we won't have time to go into all of that now. But it basically, I think a lot of it started with the French Revolution, which had a big role to play in starting the process of having freedom of religion or belief and freedom of expression. But I think the main turning point in Europe was after the Second World War. And as we know, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was adopted in the 1940s after the war. And this was the first international document, as far as my knowledge goes, that really embodies freedom of religion and freedom of expression, because these two rights were severely suppressed, and because of that suppression led to very violations of human rights, a lot of atrocities, violations of human dignity, and in fact actually genocide. And so after the adoption of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights at an international level, Europe, obviously, that was heavily affected by the Second World War, adopted in I think it was 1950, the European Convention on Human Rights, and this convention has, as I mentioned already, it has very similar wording to what we find in international law instruments. And the ambit and the scope of these rights are not as far removed from what we find in for example, in South Africa. It's just maybe find in different places and more centralized in one or two sources. But for example, to give you an idea, when one compares it also to South Africa, the right to freedom of religion or belief is protected in Article 9 of the European Convention. So not to become too technical, but it also protects a wide variety of religions, beliefs, opinions, faith. It says right to freedom of thought, opinion, and conscience, and religion, and so it really protects a wide variety of beliefs and religions. And then also it has, similar to South Africa, obviously freedom of religion or belief is not absolute. It's not an absolute right, where the South African Constitution has Section 36 as a limitation clause. The freedom of religion in the European Convention also has its own limitation clause in Article 9. And but this limitation of freedom of religion is in highly exceptional circumstances. So freedom of religion or belief in Europe is not absolute. It can be limited. So, for example, that's why during COVID, during COVID, some churches were closed because they mentioned that it's a public health risk to have people congregating at large numbers. And so this, because of the fact that the right to freedom of religion or belief can be limited in highly exceptional circumstances, then we find this part of Article 9 stating the right to freedom of religion, or the right to manifest freedom, or the right to manifest a religion or belief can be limited in exceptional circumstances. And for example, it gives a few requirements for when freedom of religion can be limited. So it says any limitation has to be prescribed by law. There has to be a legal basis for the limitation of freedom of the manifestation of religion or belief, and it's very similar to the South African proportionality analysis. So it has to be prescribed by law. Any limitation to your freedom to express your religion or belief must be necessary to achieve a specific purpose. It must be an effective way to achieve a specific purpose, and those purposes are clearly described in Article 9. So, for example, it must be to protect public health. It must, for example, during COVID, it must be to protect public order or the freedoms and rights of others. And this is a closed list. And in the same way, the right to freedom of expression is protected in Article 10 of the European Convention. Also, a wide array of expressions and opinions protected under the right to freedom of expression. But also, this right can be limited: the right to express an opinion, the right to tweet something, the right to write certain articles, or to have some artistic expression. These rights are also protected, but it can also be limited in highly exceptional circumstances. For example, it must be prescribed by law, the limitation. There must be a law stating that the limitation is allowed of your right to express yourself. It must be a necessary limitation, and it must be to serve the purpose of protecting public order, the freedoms and rights of others, and it must be the least restrictive way of achieving that purpose. So if you, for example, look at what happened, going back to freedom of religion, if you look at what happened during COVID-19, if the government always had to go and look at, is closing down churches or closing down businesses, is that really the least restrictive way to protect people during such a pandemic? Was there a less restrictive way in which people could be protected? Could other regulations be used? So was just being more careful, was that sufficient? Would that help to limit the closure of churches or businesses, etc.? So it's a what we call a proportionality analysis to see how far as possible one can protect this right and try not to limit it for specific reasons. But just one thing on the right to freedom of expression. Freedom of expression, very often people would think, well, that means that you cannot say something that is offensive, and that would be a valid limitation of freedom of expression. However, the European Court of Human Rights clearly said, and the case is called Handyside versus the United Kingdom, the court clearly said that the freedom of expression protects offensive speech. It protects speech that will shock and disturb. It will protect speech that some people might not like, that will cause certain groups to feel offended. And that is why we can see some artwork, some movies, some expression, some opinions given in media might, or cartoons might be offensive to certain religions or certain groups of people, might shock or disturb sensitivities, but that is part of the right to freedom of expression, and it's clearly protected in Europe, in the European Convention of Human Rights. And that's just to give you this broad overview of the scope of the two rights. Very, very highly protected and only limited in highly exceptional circumstances.
I think, Georgia, one of the things that you said, which is really interesting, and I think something that people perhaps aren't so aware of, is that freedom of religion and the protection that it has, and obviously it's broader than just your faith, is a relatively recent development. In other words, for most of human history, freedom of religion was by no means guaranteed under law. In fact, there were literally hundreds of years of bloody warfare fought in the European context between people of different faiths, backed by nation states and what have you. So it is very important, I think, that people understand that if we do not defend this right, because it is a new right, if we do not stand upon this right, if we do not uphold this right, then very quickly, as I think we've certainly seen in this country, and I'd be interested to hear some examples that you might have in Europe as well, as to how, let's say, erosions potentially can take place, and why it is so important, why you and the ADF are standing up for this right and for people's basically rights to be able to live their lives, to express whatever they want to express, to raise their children as they would believe fit to raise them and pass their values on to them. Maybe you could just give us a few examples on the sort of potential limitations of this, and the sort of burden of an onus of proof on the state when they come to try and limit these rights, or on any individual for that matter, if it's individual versus individual. Maybe you can give us a couple of practical examples as to how this has played out in the European context.
Yes, definitely. So, as I said, this is both these rights are hard won, and they should not be taken for granted. If we think of, they really came about or manifested concretely in documents after the Second World War, and so they were literally battled for, and the lack of having these protections, at least on paper, we can see from history, we can see from various events, and in Europe, it's definitely something that should not be taken, it shouldn't be taken for granted anywhere, but in Europe, it's really been a battle of different groups of religions against each other historically, revolutions, world wars, as we know, and so it's not something that came about easily, and it's something that has been an issue for centuries, and only recently, as we said in the half of the 1900s, where we could really see a description of what these rights are and what they should look like and when they can be limited. And currently in Europe, in theory, we have all these rights, but it doesn't mean that religious tolerance is always at a high. It doesn't mean that society is necessarily religiously tolerant. It doesn't mean that the member states, for example, where I am currently in Belgium, it doesn't mean that the Belgian government is always religiously tolerant, if we can use the word tolerance. But it does mean that it is protected in theory. However, we see challenges to this in the form of brought by way of, for example, migration, where Europe traditionally, historically, and at least within the cultural values, being more Christian of various denominations, we now see the states not knowing what to do with sudden diversity or religious diversity, which it's easy always to criticize other countries if they're not protecting various human rights and religious or linguistic diversity. But suddenly Europe which was historically kind of more or less religiously Christian, now suddenly being challenged by various other religions, new religious movements, Islam, and I think most member states now in Europe they are grappling with what to do with the sudden increasing religious diversity, and also decreasing Christian society, and how to manage all these different diversities, and with that comes challenges to freedom of expression as well. The sensitivities change, people say different things, and now there are new religions who have different doctrines and different requirements, and then we also have for Christianity itself in a more secularized Europe, for the Christian society, there are some big challenges. For example, the values of certain member states now being propagated or legislated are very different than to what it used to be, and to what traditional Christian communities will promote. If I think of, for example, the definition of marriage, and it's very different to what many Christians in Europe would propagate, and then, or would say their doctrine teaches them, and that is very different from what is being legislated by the states now, and that also creates a conflict between what can be said in churches, for example, and states trying to, in some cases, control what is being said, and persons being actually religious ministers being persecuted for teaching something that is different to what is being propagated by different member states.
So Georgia, you raise very interesting points there, and this just makes me think of hate speech laws. Because obviously, as you've said, religious freedom and freedom of expression are closely intertwined, because you don't have religious freedom if you're only allowed to believe in your heart and pray in your room, but you're not allowed to take it out into society and live according to your belief, live according to your conscience, not be forced to do something against your conscience and talk about it publicly. So what you were saying now, it reminds me of hate speech laws. So, I mean, we've spoken about this in terms of like the hate speech bill in South Africa and 4SS concerns on that. For those viewers who are interested, we'll link it at the end of this interview. You can watch 4SS concerns about the hate speech bill, which is working its way through the South African Parliament. But in the European context, is freedom of expression under threat with states censoring speech and promulgating hate speech laws? Because it sounds like it is. And I mean, it's very interesting if one looks at what you described as the origins of freedom of religion and freedom of expression actually being protected in Europe, because you were looking at fascist states who had extreme propaganda resulting in genocide, a world war that decimated millions. And you would think that any member state would be very reticent to start regulating any form of speech. And again, you start seeing, as you were saying now, the state inadvertently adopting a specific ideology and promoting that and outlawing anything that offends, shocks, and disturbs that ideology, and people who adhere to that ideology.
I think as well, just to chip in for a minute, the other thing which I think I've noticed in Europe is that public order seems to be also used as a kind of a way of shutting down viewpoints and opinions that people don't like. They don't just seem to use pure hate speech. There's this sort of overarching public order disturbing the peace type of view. So maybe you could just give us a better sense of the European context in that regard.
Yes, it's very complex legally, because just to come to the public order aspect that is being used. So the European Court of Human Rights, the main body that has been interpreting freedom of religion, they've been for example, in France, we see public order and public security being used a lot to ban headscarves or burqas, and in the public sphere for the Muslim community. And the one thing that France uses a lot is this idea of living together, and that we have to be able to live together as a society, and the burqa prohibits this. And then they would also use public security and public order as saying, well, it's a way of achieving public order in France, not to allow the headscarf in certain instances, or the burqa, the full face veil. And so the issue with that is that the European Court of Human Rights, as a general body over European countries, they've been saying, well, let's go to the margin of appreciation. Let's allow governments to determine for themselves, because they have different religious and historical and political contexts. Let us allow them to determine for themselves how they will sort out their religious diversity, and in that way, countries like France have been able to get away with bans on headscarves. So the court would just say, oh, because of the margin of appreciation, we will not interfere with for example, France's laws on burqa bans. But on the other hand, in some ways, it can be good to protect kind of the national political historical context. On the other hand, it allows countries to get away with violations of internationally determined human rights standards. And so that has been one of the problems in Europe, where the court should have stepped in my opinion, but did not properly interpret its own laws. And with regards to hate speech, well, the biggest problem we see with hate speech is that whereas as I explained, with freedom of expression, you are able to say things that are shocking and disturbing to religions, to persons of different ideologies, but this is under threat in hate speech. But it also threatens freedom of religion, not only freedom of expression, but also freedom of religion, because now we see various religions who have specific beliefs about things that the state might not agree with, and they express those beliefs and religion and opinions or doctrines, and it might offend some people. It might offend certain ideologies. For example, if a pastor in a church preaches that a marriage is one man and one woman, that might offend the LGBTQ ideologies. Also, it might offend various ideas that the state wants to enhance in a country. So here we also see hate speech laws, and I will discuss a bit more about what that is. But here we see that it is a threat to that, because some religious doctrines and the way it is expressed might offend some groups. And here, this is where hate speech laws can have a very stifling effect also on freedom of religion or belief, because people will not be able to express their religious doctrines anymore or live out their faith. Daniela, you rightly said that, and Michael as well, that yes, freedom, people tend to forget very quickly. Freedom of expression and freedom of religion, these rights are extremely important in Europe, and we've seen at what cost they came, as you said, genocide, fascist countries, communism. Europe has this whole history of events that show you the importance of freedom of religion and freedom of expression. Yet we seem to forget very quickly, because now, as recent as, so this is just to give you an idea of how recent and how new this sudden surge of hate speech is in Europe as well. It's not as, I don't think the European Union as such is as far as Michael mentioned before South Africa, or leading the way, because as recent as December of last year, December 2021, the European Commission adopted a communication where it says they want to introduce hate speech and hate crime as a crime in the European Union. So this is very, very interesting, because it's not just saying we want to introduce hate speech in one country and that it finds application in that country. It's saying that we want to have hate speech become an European Union-wide crime. And to give you an idea, this is a closed list of crimes listed in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union in Article 83. And this list of crimes includes terrorism, human trafficking, atrocious crimes that can be committed, and it has a specifically serious nature. It says these are in the law. It says these are particularly serious crimes. So illicit drug trafficking, money laundering, corruption, computer crime, organized crime. This is the list of crimes that we can call EU crimes. Now, they want to place hate speech within this list, and this has a few implications, or a number of implications. First of all, it has a cross-border implication. That means that it won't make hate speech a crime only in one EU member state, for example, only in Poland, or only in Belgium, or only in the Netherlands. It becomes an EU-wide crime. So it is a crime. First of all, now it enters freedom of expression, or hate speech now enters the criminal law sphere, and it's going to be an EU-wide crime where the European Union will say, which applies to 27 member states now, saying this is what hate speech is going to be, and this is what the penalties should be. And it also means that if, for example, you commit a crime in Netherlands and you travel to a different European country, what does it mean practically? Does it mean European-wide you can be convicted of hate speech? So it's not just that it's in one member state, but it's European-widely then a crime. And so it also enters the criminal law sphere, which means there are criminal penalties attached to it, and you will now have to so it has a different dimension immediately. And so the issue, and I'm sure this is the same in South Africa as well, is that the European Union has been using the phrase hate speech a lot in different reports, in different documents.
But what does it mean?
Yes, exactly.
What is it? Does everyone agree on a definition? And I mean, Georgia, another question for you is this EU Commission communication, which seems to go against what the UN has said, because the UN's official position is more speech is the remedy for hate speech. Let people talk it out in public. What is the status of this communication? Because I mean, obviously that would have to be adopted into that treaty that you mentioned for it to have any legal status. So perhaps speak to those two things. What is the definition being proposed for hate speech? Because if you're going to criminalize something and you're going to limit freedom of thought, essentially, because you can't express information and you can't receive information, then that needs to have a very narrow definition.
Well, that's the problem. The European Commission in their communication basically said hate is hate. And that is their definition of hate speech. They said hate is
circular.
Yes. We've heard similar things. Love is love, hate is hate, and they said hate speech is incitement to hatred and violence. And then it goes on to say that it's speech that offends or disturbs, etc. And so here we see clearly this goes against what I mentioned earlier in the case of handicide. Yes, freedom of expression protects speech that offends and disturbs. And so what happens with hate speech is, first of all, there is no clear definition. As you said, the Commission didn't give a definition. It just says hate is hate. Secondly, it limits speech that might offend and that might shock and disturb. And also, the victim of this is not clear. It's not even clear whether there should be a victim. And then whoever a victim is can be evolving. Is it a group of people? Should there be a victim? And then very often it doesn't even matter if, will it, or we can ask the question, will it matter whether the person who said the offensive thing, will it matter whether it was intentionally offensive, or will it only matter whether the person who received the information, what their subjective feelings are? And then the other thing is, how do you determine subjective feelings in criminal law? In criminal law, firstly, it has to be clear what the crime is. The penalties must be clear. There must be a clear victim. And then there is a whole body of rules on negligence and intent and so forth, that there has to be negligence and intent. So if you put hate speech within the criminal law sphere, where crimes are clearly defined, where definitions are very important, but suddenly you have no definition, you have no clear prescribed laws, you have no victim necessarily, intent is not clearly a requirement, or there is no body of knowledge on what that means, that becomes very problematic. It's not only a violation of freedom, potential violation of freedom of religion or belief, and a clear violation of freedom of expression, but it's also an upside down application of how we've understood criminal law for centuries.
I find it very interesting because it seems that states have forgotten what their duty is, which is to create a space for all rights to flourish and not to pick a side and suppress rights. And it seems very interesting that South Africa seems to be blazing the trail here with our hate crimes and hate speech bill. And it's very concerning what you were saying about victim now, because I mean, this was a discussion we were having yesterday when we were discussing the hate speech bill in its current form, because in South Africa, if that bill passes, a juristic person, a company, can be a victim of hate speech. Now, what inherent dignity does a company have?
Definitely. So also here in Europe, I believe there are many examples, but they haven't given any definition on which we can hook any victim status, or what they mean with incitement to violence, or what they mean with violence, or even what is meant with hate. How do you define hate? I mean, how do you define
hate is hate? Georgia, clearly we are just too dumb to understand, because, you know, between the three of us, it should be clear that hate is hate.
Well,
Georgia,
yes.
Georgia, give us there's another case which I know Daniela's been looking at, which I think a German case is Päivi. Is that the right way to pronounce it, Daniela?
Yes. It's a Finnish case, and it concerns what you're referring to is Päivi Räsänen, and then also very less in the media would be the case of Bishop Pojola as well, together with her. Yes, that's a very interesting case. We can discuss that if you wish.
Yes, that seems, if I remember rightly from that case, they were tweeting of scriptures, and she was a member of the Finnish parliament, and he was a Lutheran bishop. And those cases, as you say, almost like in parallel, but it did seem from the outside that it was absolutely bizarre that a member of parliament in a nation would be on trial criminally for simply quoting Bible scriptures. And obviously that would perhaps even be a more profile case than a bishop doing the same thing, but utterly extraordinary when you think about what you started And again, it's almost like a full circle. Like you started off by saying how well protected in the 1950s leading after the Second World War, and they put all these tremendous protections in place. And now look at us here. Here we are, 2021, 2022. And it looks as if this whole thing is literally sweeping in an opposite direction. And perhaps, is there hope in these cases that you just mentioned?
Well, Michael, the case of Päivi and Bishop Ajola are, as you said, the cases are extremely bizarre, and it's almost unbelievable. I will give you some context of why it is so bizarre as well. As you know, Päivi, she was convicted of for 2 crimes, and the one was for publishing a booklet. It was called Male and Female. He created them, and she published this, I think it was 2004. So quite a different decade, a different time, especially when we look at LGBTQ ideologies and the development of certain aspects surrounding LGBTQ rights. And so this booklet this booklet was then published by Bishop Ajola. So she was, one of the things she was now being convicted for was the publication of this booklet. Now, first of all, it has been, I think, if I counted correctly, 18 years ago, a different time, different values, different interpretation of specific, of what a family is, etc. And so she's being charged for something that she did that was not a crime 18 years ago. So that's like being, now you have to be careful about everything that you do, because it might be a crime within 20 years, and then you might be retroactively.
Or everything you've ever done for that matter.
Yes, yes.
But I mean,
Yes.
Georgia, this goes against a very basic principle of criminal law, is that it can't be, a law can't be applied retrospectively.
Exactly, and that is how, as I said, the way we apply and understand criminal law is by hate speech. It's being turned upside down, and just not only that, now she's being charged. She's saying that she committed this crime, but that was the one matter. And the second matter was she merely tweeted a Bible verse, Romans 1 verses 24 to 27, which essentially talks about homosexuality as sinful. And she tweeted this as criticism towards her own church, because they supported the Helsinki Pride event. And she published this, and she said, well, this is what the Bible says, but you are not, and you preach the Bible, but you are not following it. And she just tweeted this picture of her Bible. And then she was being convicted of a crime they call in Finland. So this is but this is what is even more bizarre for me, is that the heading under which we find this crime in the Finnish statute books, in the Finnish laws, they call the heading war crimes and crimes against humanity. And then the crime that she was being convicted for is called ethnic agitation. And so she is being convicted of ethnic agitation for a crime, for something she did 18 years ago, which was not a crime at that time, which is also not necessarily a crime now. And also she is being convicted for a crime that is something that they call ethnic agitation, which is defined under a chapter on war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that would be, usually we would understand that as genocide and as atrocities committed against human beings, like we find in Rwanda, like we find in countries like Syria and Iraq. But this is happening in Europe, and she's being charged for a war crime and a crime against humanity.
For a tweet.
And for a tweet of a picture of the Bible. And we don't have, so she offended someone. We're not clear, probably her church, but we're not very clear who the victim is, who she ethnically agitated. And she's being punished for a past action which was not a crime, which was maybe more culturally acceptable at that time. And if we look at just taking this back to, let's say, the crime, the hate speech becomes an EU crime. As I said earlier, as the European Commission said, they are now trying to make hate speech an EU crime. Let's say that happens. Would Päivi then be, as we said, she's a member of parliament in Finland, and now she's being charged of ethnic agitation, which is essentially a hate speech crime. Then, if we look at what they said she was doing, she said she ethnically agitated, and that's hate speech, and etc. And so, would she then be able to travel to different European countries, and would she be charged of hate speech in different member states of the European Union because of the cross-border application of making hate speech an European Union-wide crime? And how would that work? And I mean, what would be the consequences for someone like her? And what is more worrying is that she, in the lower courts, she was found innocent on all charges, and she was both she and Bishop Ajola. But the prosecutor now appealed, and the appeal will probably be only heard in end of 2023. So this also means years of stress and drama, having to
pay for the lawyers.
Yes, and so all these things, it's not only a legal issue, but it's also taking a toll on the human dignity of people who are being convicted for something that they freely did, they were allowed to do years ago. And we hope, and that we really hope that this initiative of the European Commission making hate speech an EU crime will not go through. It's still, as you asked also a question earlier, which I didn't answer, for that to become a reality, the Council of the European Union has to all agree unanimously that hate speech must become an EU crime. And that means that all the member states
47.
So now we're talking about the European Union. So all the 27 member states have to agree that hate speech should become an EU crime. And luckily at the moment, from what we know, and it's also not that transparent, from what we know, there are some countries or member states blocking this. And so there is no currently no unanimous agreement that it should become an EU crime. However, the European Union is trying to take away some requirements regarding unanimity, that they're trying to replace the requirement that these decisions should be made by unanimity with more like what they call a qualified majority vote. So that's also in the pipeline in the European Union. So we will see where that brings us. But currently, it's still not a EU-wide crime.
So the Päivi case, that is still within the Finland judicial system. The prosecutor isn't appealing it to the European Court of Human Rights yet.
Not yet. No, it's still now going to the highest. I guess they call it. I'm not sure if they call it the appeal court in Finland, but the highest court in Finland still.
Okay.
Still
so
national.
their version of the South African Court.
Yes.
Got it.
Yes.
Well, Georgia, we are very grateful to you, to the ADF International, for the stand that you take on behalf of faith and freedom in the European context. And we're also so grateful for the opportunity that we have to keep regular contact with you. And it is so important because, as we know, often the principles and cases or the laws that are being formulated internationally tend to filter their way down into our context too. So thank you for the stand that you're taking and for giving us the time that you've given us this morning, and for such an interesting and valuable conversation. We really appreciate you.
Thank you, Freedom of Religion South Africa, and Michael and Daniela.
Good day. This is Daniela Ellerbeck, the legal advisor to Freedom of Religion South Africa. Remember to like and share this video, and then click on the subscribe button to make sure you never miss our video updates on vital religious freedom issues.